So you've all got a copy of the programme in your packs. So as you can see, we're going to kick off with just a very brief introduction from me. I'm Professor Louise Ryan, and I'm co-director of the Social Policy Research Centre here at Middlesex University. Then we are delighted to welcome Professor Crossley from Manchester, who's going to be our keynote speaker today. And he's speaking about a very exciting project on music. I've read some of your stuff on music before, so I know it's going to be really interesting. Then at 11 o'clock we have the first session, which is going to be on qualitative network map interviews and biographical network interviews, and on lessons from understanding social capital. Then at 12:30 to 1:30 we have lunch. Lunch will be served in this room. We're sorry about that, but because the exams are going on, we weren't allowed to use the mezzanine because obviously that might lead to noise and disturbance for the students who are doing exams. And I would just like to remind you that there are exams, unfortunately, going on all around us. So if you do need to step outside, we would really appreciate it if you didn't talk too much just around here, because they are doing exams just next door. Also, just another piece of housekeeping with regard to toilets. If you need to use the toilets, can you please go out this door here, and that will allow you to go straight through to the toilets, which are located on the left. If you go out that door, you will not be able to go through to the toilets because this door here is closed for security purposes. So you won't use this door, okay? Otherwise you'll get stuck out there and you won't be able to proceed. Okay, so as I said, lunch will be from 12:30 to 1:30. Then we have the next session B is at 1:30 until 3. And that's going to look at qualitative methods, network boundaries and hidden mechanisms in network research, using agent-based simulation to integrate micro-qualitative evidence and macro-quantitative data, and network mapping through stories. Then we will have a presentation about SNAG, the Social Networks Analysis Group of the British Sociological Association. That will take place between 3 and 3:15, then we have a coffee break. And then we have the final session, session C, which will run from 3:30 to 4:30, and that's going to look at network ethnography and using mixed methods to investigate the meaning structure of personal social networks. And then we will close from 4:30 to 5 with the final discussion. Okay, for those people who've come in late, there's one chair up here, which we could squeeze in around the table somehow. So would somebody like to come up here, please? And there's another chair down there back. Maybe we could just make a bit of... is there somebody sitting in that seat?
Yes, it's me.
Louise, that's me. Oh, okay, sorry, there is somebody there. If we could just make a bit of space, we can squeeze you in there. Okay, so if we're all ready, I'll just give you a few words of context, I guess, before I introduce Professor Nick Crossley. I'm actually wearing two hats here today because, as well as being co-director of the Social Policy Research Centre at Middlesex, I'm also a trustee and publications director for the British Sociological Association. So on behalf of the British Sociological Association, which is co-sponsoring this event, I'd like to welcome you as well. Just to say a little bit about the work we do at the Social Policy Research Centre, and there is a flyer, I believe, about the SPRC in your packs, which tells you something about the work that we do. Oh, and a handout is being distributed right while I'm speaking. Okay, well, obviously that's a bit of a competition. Okay, so just to say something about my own research on social networks. I first became interested in social networks about 12 years ago when I was doing a large quantitative study at the Royal Free Hospital, which is here in London, looking at depression. And one of the things that we found in that study was the protective mechanisms of social networks and support for people suffering from mental illness. And that sort of kicked off an interest of mine on social networks that I've now been pursuing, as I said, for more than a decade. Most of my work is on the area of migration. And as we all know, within migration studies, there's been a huge body of literature on how networks facilitate mobility processes. But what I was more interested in is what happens post-migration, and how do migrants build new connections after they arrive in the destination country, particularly in terms of friendship networking and the role of friendship for migrants in a new destination. And in the research that I was doing, which was qualitative life narrative approaches, it was quite clear about the dynamism of social networks over time, particularly through the life course. And I suppose in a sense, a lot of our research is kind of biographical in that we end up researching things that are of interest to us personally. And I think it's interesting that as you move through the life course and past different life stages, for example, having children, that perhaps you become more aware of the way in which networks often follow those kinds of life course changes. So particularly around the role of children in the way people develop new networking opportunities. And that was something that I was very interested in my research, particularly with Irish and then with Polish migrants here in London. But one of the things that I found quite frustrating, particularly in relation to migration studies, was the very descriptive way in which most migration scholars tended to talk about social networks, networks as a metaphor. Often without much engagement with a long-established body of literature, particularly in sociology, the kind of classical literature around social networks within sociology, going right back to the 1950s and the work of Elizabeth Botton and many others since then. So what I've been trying to do in my research is kind of move away from the Putnam obsession within much of migration studies. Most migration scholars begin by quoting Putnam and kind of end by quoting Putnam, as if that was the kind of all you needed to know about bridging and bonding was what Putnam says. And I'm kind of fed up with papers on migration studies that just have that kind of view of networks. So what I've been trying to do over the last 10 years is really challenge that, particularly in relation to bonding and bridging, and push it beyond that very dichotomous view, which not just Putnam, but I think the way people perhaps simplify, in fact, what Putnam has said in terms of bridging and bonding. In terms of then taking the social network analysis beyond those very simplistic terms, particularly within qualitative research in migration studies, my foray into more technical social network analysis ended up making me feel quite fearful that I just didn't understand what people were talking about. And Alessio and I went to a conference at Greenwich University a few years ago where there were many presentations using very complicated mathematical formula in how to measure social networks, which I felt, for me, wasn't really answering my questions either, in terms of counting ties and ending up with quite complicated formulae about the content of ties. So what I wanted to do was to really try to bring together my interests in terms of perhaps a more technical understanding of networks, but also understanding the meaning of ties and what these relationships, what these friendships, for example, actually mean to migrants. And so this is where the work of Nick Crossley and also his colleague Gemma Edwards have been so important in informing my own work, and it's why it's such a pleasure to have both Gemma and Nick here today. Because now Alessio and I here at the SPRC were really trying to develop this focus on using mixed methods, particularly in relation to migration and looking at migrant networks. And we are working closely with Paula, who's here from Greenwich University, and the three of us have been developing some work around mixed methods. So for us, this day promises to be really fascinating, really informative in terms of taking our own work forward as well. So without any further ado, I would like now to hand over to Professor Nick Crossley, and I'm sure we're all very interested in what he has to say. Over to you, Nick.
Okay, so, well, firstly, thank you to Louise and the other organisers for inviting me. I think it's a very exciting seminar by the programme, and I'm delighted to be involved in it. What I've decided to do for today's session is really just to reflect back over a project which I very recently finished, insofar as you ever finish a project, a piece of work that I feel as if I've more or less wrapped up, and to try to reflect back upon the methodology of that I've employed in that project, and from the point of view of mixed methods, just kind of thinking, well, how did I mix methods, why did I mix methods, and so on. And the project has broadly had three questions, three foci. Firstly, how and why did UK punk emerge when and where it did? So it emerged firstly in London between 1975 and 1976. And one of my big questions, as having been a sort of 10-year-old boy, probably 8-year-old boy really, when punk emerged and been just been absolutely bowled over by it, fascinated by it, enthused for it ever since. There was a biographical reason for wanting to do this, but also as a scholar with an interest in collective action and mobilisation, there was a more academic aspect to this question as well. Why and where do collective actions happen when and where they do? I was also interested in how this collective action then subsequently diffused throughout the UK, but also beyond the bounds of the UK. And I was interested in specifically how it took hold in a number of other UK cities, Manchester, Liverpool and Sheffield, becoming a translocal phenomenon, but also in those sites, punk began to mutate into something else, something that we call post-punk, and I was interested in that process as well. But most of what I have to say today will relate to the red question. In order to keep things concise, I've decided to focus primarily on that. Okay, so broadly the methodology began as an intensive case study of the London punk world from January 75 to December 76. And in a sense, the project unfolded over time. I didn't have all the ideas of what I was going to do at the start. I started off by looking at London, and then I realised that in a sense, only looking at one site of punk's emergence limited my limited what I could say even about that one site. I needed some sort of comparison, I felt, in order to establish certain of the claims that I was going to want to make. So I extended that with a partially comparative case study then of London and of Manchester over this period, 1975 to 1976. And Manchester is significant partly because that's where I'm based, but also because it's widely regarded as the second city of punk. There was a punk world developed in Manchester very, very rapidly after London, and partly in response to the trigger that London provided. And I suppose again on the biographical level, there was that kind of northern belligerence informed the question, why did it happen in London first and not in Manchester? Everybody knows it should have happened in Manchester first. But there was also an analytic question there as well, just of, well, why did it? Given that most of the components, the relevant elements that I'd identified as important in London were also present in Manchester, why was it that London was at the leading edge of this? And then I subsequently added my further case studies, again tracing Manchester into the post-punk era and looking at Liverpool and London as well. Okay, where were networks important in this? Well, networks were important conceptually because I drew upon the work of Howard Becker and his idea of art worlds to think about what punk was, and networks are an important, very important element in art worlds as Becker defines them. So just purely at a definitional level, networks were important. Irrespective of this, it was very quickly apparent to me that networks were incredibly important in the context of the London case, and indeed the other cases as well. I mean, I guess I knew before I even started the project that this person knew that person, and that person played in a band with that person before the main band that they were known for, and so on. So I kind of had a sense that the London punks were networked. But as I began to investigate it, that just became more and more apparent. Every sort of fresh avenue that I seemed to go down ultimately ended up turning around and bringing me back to a group of other people I was already familiar with, and the sense of network built very quickly. thirdly, following on from that, and borrowing from social movement theory, I hypothesised that networks were just bound to be important to the explanation of collective action. Social movement scholars have argued and established over numerous case studies the importance of networks to mobilisation and to collective action. And given that the emergence of punk is as much an instance of collective action as any other, I just expected theoretically that would be that would be important. And just to very briefly explain why social movement scholars think that networks are important to collective action. Firstly, issues of coordination. If you're going to have gigs and you want to get audiences to gigs, there's got to be coordination. The different players in the process have got to be coordinated and know what one another are doing. And if they're going to do that, there has to be some communication between them. And if there's some communication between them, then there's a network. Also, the pooling and exchange and mobilisation of various kinds of resources. You've got guitarists looking for bassists, looking for drummers, looking for managers, looking for studio spaces, and so on. And if the right resources are going to get to the right people, again, there has to be some kind of network that enables that to take place. I was interested in the formation of styles. How is it? Because one of the things, think back to the 8-year-old boy who is watching Top of the Pops or whatever, and then sees Johnny Rotten, and then sees Joe Strummer, and then sees Susie Sue, and there's some evident stylistic similarity between them and their audiences, and thinks, well, how on earth is it that all these people seem to have decided to dress in this strange way at more or less the same time in the same place? And again, that's about interaction and mutual influence, and what Durkheim refers to as collective effervescence, that sort of collective creativity that gives rise to a style. There are issues of solidarity and mutual support, exciting as it may be to stick safety pins through your ears and spike your hair up and, you know, wear tartan bondage trousers and all the rest of it. It got people beaten up. It got people had a hard time. It's a kind of it's perhaps not the kind of thing that you would want to do as an individual, but doing it as part of a collective and getting the kind of support that's involved, and that makes things easier. And then, of course, there are issues of recruitment and diffusion. You know, how do people ever find out about it? How does it ever go from being something that half a dozen people are doing in a small club in London to something that half the world is involved in? And those same points obviously apply in relationship to post-punk in Manchester and Liverpool and in London. But this then begs further questions about how networks, for example, are formed. So how is it that Joe Strummer knows Malcolm McLaren, knows the Sex Pistols, and so on? Okay, so just trailing back a little bit to my northern belligerence and my comparison of London and Manchester, it struck me that that one potential explanation for why networks had taken off in London quicker than they'd taken off in Manchester was because all of the players involved in the London punk world seemed to know one another. When at that same point in time, it seemed that there were lots of enthusiasts in Manchester, but they existed in distinct pockets. So it seemed to me that that networks might be a crucial part in this story. And so I compared the networks in Manchester and in London at the same point in time. So this is June 1976, just before punk started to take off really in Manchester. And you can see that there is a big contrast between those two networks. And I mean, I don't need to, sometimes when I give this presentation, the next slide up would be a table with comparing densities and number of components and path lengths and all the rest of it, but you don't really need that. You can kind of see that London had a single, relatively cohesive, single component network, whereas Manchester at this particular point in time was very fragmented insofar as we would say that there was a network at all. But of course, Manchester got its network. So by 1980, everybody in the Manchester world was connected by one path or another. And it was important that London hadn't always been a cohesive single component network. When I took it back to London in January of 1975, as in Manchester in June '76, it was fragmented. You can see all the isolates up there at the sides and these much smaller components of groups of people. And one of the things that I was able to do in my project was to trace London across 6 time points, looking at how the network had formed. Sorry, that's just tracking the number of components and size of components and average degree over that time. Okay, so now the question of mixing methods and how and why I wanted to mix methods. And the first reason for this was that this concept of music worlds, or this concept of art worlds that I was involved in, networks were very central to it, but networks weren't the only element that Becker deemed important in relationship to art worlds. So he also talks about places, he talks about conventions, in the sense of action that is conventional, rather than events that are conventions, and resources. So in a sense, that my theoretical definition of my object of analysis included networks, but wasn't exclusively about networks. So that was one important consideration, because if I was going to make access and analyse and look at places and conventions and resources, I couldn't do that with social network analysis, not in the sort of conventional form that I had been using. And similarly, networks are only one part of my explanation of these musical worlds. I think I've probably come to the conclusion that networks are a necessary causal element in the formation of a music world, but they're not a sufficient cause of the emergence of any kind of music world or collective action, for the obvious reason really that networks are ubiquitous. We find networks everywhere in life, and yet we don't find emerging punk worlds everywhere in social life. And this is a similar, familiar argument, I guess, from social movement studies as well, that for years social movement studies scholars banged on and said, it's networks, it's networks, it's networks, and then it's kind of pointed out that, but networks don't lead to mobilisation most of the time. They only lead to mobilisation when other elements and other ingredients fall in place. So that was a key driver for me. I knew that it wasn't going to be enough just to say these people knew one another or interacted with one another. I had to be able to say something more than that. And also I think I was informed by the fact that this was case study research, and that case study research makes a demand for detail. At the end of the day, I only looked at 4 music worlds. And if I've got loads of music worlds, then if I had a big N, as people seem to call it these days, then perhaps qualitative detail wouldn't have been as important, wouldn't have been necessary. But it didn't. I was dealing with a very small number of case studies, and I felt that the strength of the case that I was going to make was going to have to therefore rest upon detail. It was going to have to rest upon the fact that I knew these 4 cases very, very well. And there's only so much detail, only so much important detail that can be captured using SNA. And there's lots of other detail that just gets pushed out because it doesn't fit and it doesn't work. And that seemed to me that I couldn't afford to do that, given that I was dealing with a small number of case studies. Also, because it was historical research, I was working with archival and textual sources. So I was working with sources which were already qualitative, if you like. I couldn't go out and administer a survey. I had to explore what was there in the archives and try to reconstruct the network upon that basis. And more significantly than that, those sources told me a lot more than what was than what I was able to deal with quantitatively. They told me things that went way beyond what I was able to record in adjacency matrices and so on. And yet at the same time, they didn't tell me enough to generate more quantitative data. I'll explain what I mean by this in a minute. But they required me to go beyond, I think, quantitative analysis, the quantitative analysis of social network analysis. And then finally I was inspired by recent theoretical debates on qualitative aspects and elements in networks, the kind of things that Anne Misch and Mustafa Enibeyer and other people have been writing about. And I agree with what they have to say, and so it's an obvious thing to do. Okay, so I just want to focus now briefly on what I said about information which kind of goes beyond my quantitative SNA needs, but at the same time doesn't allow me to perhaps push it for further quantification. I just want to give you a quote, I suppose it's sort of a typical quote of the kinds of things that I was looking for and working with in the archives. In this case, it's actually from a secondary source, from Pat Gilbert's book on the Clash. He says, on Saturday, 2nd of August 1975, he goes on to describe this gig by Deaf School, was to witness one of the most momentous events in rock and roll history. Mick, that's Mick Jones of the Clash, and Tony James, who was in the band Chelsea and then Generation X, crashing into future Clash manager Bernie Rhodes. He said, "You're wearing one of my t-shirts." And then the paragraph goes on to explain how Bernie Rhodes manages London SS, and that's the band that Mick Jones and Tony James are trying to put together. So from this quotation, we can add 2 1s to our adjacency matrix immediately. We've got a link between Tony James and Bernie Rhodes. We've got a link between Mick Jones and Bernie Rhodes. We probably would have known that anyway. I mean, it's not a kind of a massive revelation at this point in the research, but nevertheless, you can do that. And we can also start to date those ties. We know that tie was formed on 2nd of August 1975, and we know something about the way in which that tie was formed. So we know that there was a specific focus. I don't know whether people are familiar with Scott Feld's idea of foci and the way in which networks are formed through foci. So a foci is a time and a place which is of relevance to people who have particular kinds of interests, and it generates networks of people who share particular kinds of interests because they converge upon that time and space at the same time. And that enables them to meet. So you might think of smokers in an organisation. Smokers in an organisation probably know one another because they all have to hang out outside the front of the building to smoke at sort of break time or at lunchtime, whenever it might be. And of course it's similar in music. The jazz fans in a particular town are more likely to know one another than know people at random, because they'll go to the same gigs, they'll go to the same record shops, they'll go to and so on. And so we get a sense here of a specific focus, which was the Deaf School gig that Mick Jones and Tony James and Bernie Rhodes all turned up to. And we've also perhaps got a sense of a focal type. Deaf School were pub rockers. They were part of the pub rock scene that preceded punk in London and various other cities as well. So we've got some kind of sense of how the tie is formed and maybe how the network is beginning to take shape. But I think importantly, that information can be used qualitatively, and it can be used in a descriptive quantitative sense. But we've not got the kind of information that we need to go on to construct statistical models or to do more complex quantitative kinds of things, because for a start off we don't know who wasn't at that gig and who didn't meet when they were at that gig, and we don't have the kind of uniform information or in relationship to any of these kind of events. We don't have the uniform information about who was there, who wasn't, who met, who didn't, that would allow us to construct a statistical model or a more sophisticated quantitative network investigation. So we've got this information that we can use. It seems really important, it seems really relevant, but we've got to do something qualitative with it. We can't do something quantitative with it. We also know from that quote that Jones and James had probably been to Malcolm McLaren's shop. That's the bit about the t-shirt. Bernie Rhodes produced, people remember the very provocative t-shirts that the punks used to wear, they were usually kind of based on sexual fetish kinds of themes and images. And Rhodes and Jones and James meet up with one another because Mick Jones is wearing one of these t-shirts. Bernie Rhodes had designed it, he'd sold it through McLaren's shop. But so we know that they met, but we also know that they obviously hadn't formed ties through the shop, because a lot of people at that point in time were forming ties through the shop. That was one of the key foci that generated the network. And we also know that because Deaf School were forerunners of the Liverpool punk world, Deaf School came from Liverpool, when I'm thinking about my comparisons and I'm thinking about, well, why did it happen in London and not in Manchester or in Liverpool or in Sheffield, it's interesting because I can see that obviously some of the Liverpool bands were sufficiently interesting to draw audiences when they played in London, and so I've got more of a sense of what's going on in my different sites. Okay, and this is just to give you some idea of quantitatively what I was able to do with this kind of information. So every time I spotted the forming of a connection, I was able to record how that connection had been formed, and in most cases it was through foci of various kinds, but there was also quite a lot formed through transitivity as well, so that's to say formed when two people met and then introduced their friends to one another. That was a significant factor as well. So I was able to do something descriptively, quantitatively with that. And I was also able to feed that into my time-sensitive data as well. So I was able to spot when people met, where they met, and to sort of reconstruct the formation of the network, again in a descriptive, quantitative sense there. But I was also able to push on a little bit and to start to say, well, what were these ties about? What was happening within these ties? And it was quite interesting, and it led me to a particularly, I think, significant element of the overall study. So a couple of quotes here. The first from Tony James about Bernie Rhodes. So Bernie was my worst nightmare. He'd ring my house, I'd be on the phone for 3 hours whilst Bernie asked me why I wasn't reading Jean-Paul Sartre. Why didn't I leave my parents and live with a hooker over Christmas? Toughen up. I need you to go to your local newsagent and buy Gay News and Spare Rib, the lesbian magazine. You need to toughen up. He gave me a reading list and I would get the books from the library and read them all. And then similarly, Mick Jones says something along the same lines. Me and Bernie struck up a friendship straight away. It was like he knew everything and I knew nothing. And he said, you don't know nothing to me, and Tony James. He always talked like that. He made you think about things in a different way. So I was starting to get a sense here of the way in which there were perhaps intellectuals, if you like, movement intellectuals involved in punk, who were picking up upon these young would-be musicians and were trying to form these young would-be musicians in a particular way, in their own image. And I found lots of other qualitative information that gave me a similar kind of picture. So this is Jamie Reid. Jamie Reid is the artist who designed all the Sex Pistols' early record covers, and he was really he was probably one of the first artists in the UK to explore situationism and to take up the kind of situationist themes. And he says, I used to talk to John Lydon, that's Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, a lot about suburban press, about situationism. The Sex Pistols seem the perfect vehicle to communicate ideas that have been formulated and to get them across very direct to people who weren't getting the message from left-wing politics. And so this is just, I mean Johnny Rotten says that that's low rubbish, he says, you know, nonsense, but then he would. So I think that the important thing is I get lots of quotes along these lines that suggested that there were a particular group of people in the network who were informed about philosophy, informed about art theory, about politics, and who were trying to work with these young musicians to politicise the music and perhaps to make something a stronger, aesthetic, more challenging aesthetic element to that music. And interestingly, that also then fed back into the network diagram, because all of those agitators, as I came to think of them, were concentrated in this early, this is the first snapshot I've got of the London punk network, and all of them are involved in this small circle of people here who revolved around Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's shop on King's Road. So there's Jamie Reid, and there's Bernie Rhodes. And this was a group of older, better resourced, better educated, and for the most part more politicised actors. And they were already a network before punk came along and before punk happened. I think another important element for me in terms of mixing methods was that mixing methods allowed me to capture the ambivalence of ties in a way that I probably couldn't have captured in a straightforward adjacency matrix. So in particular, the ties seem to be simultaneously cooperative and helpful. People were helping each other out in terms of social capital that Louise was talking about before. There was lots of sharing of resources. People were doing favours for one another. People were helping each other out. You can use our rehearsal space. You can use our equipment. You can do this. And yet at the same time, they were clearly very, very competitive and antagonistic. And to some extent, the different styles that formed within the early punk world were formed in the way that they did because people were trying to draw differences and distinctions between themselves within the network. So these first two quotes here emphasise the competitive element and emphasise the sense in which people really wanted to get on with what they wanted to get on with, because they thought if we don't do it, then the others are going to beat us to it. But then we also see that when the Clash were in the process of deciding to incorporate reggae numbers into their set, they went to talk to the Sex Pistols about it first. They didn't know whether they should do it or not, so they met with the Sex Pistols. When Bernie Rhodes found London SS rehearsal space, he got Steve Jones of the Sex Pistols turned up with a load of stolen equipment for London SS to use. So there was a sharing and borrowing of equipment. And when Mick Jones and Paul Simonon of the Clash first met up, or didn't first meet up, but met up in a significant meeting with Joe Strummer, they were with Glenn Matlock of the Sex Pistols, and it was because Glenn Matlock knew Joe Strummer that Mick and Paul got to know Joe Strummer and got the conversation going that perhaps played a role in persuading him to join the Clash. So there's a kind of sense of, well, yes, these relationships are competitive, but they're also cooperative, and they seem to just be able to be both of those things at once, and indeed antagonistic and cooperative. And of course, concepts of multiplexity allow us to think about this, and if we had uniform information on all the people in the network, we could construct multiple adjacency matrices recording these different types of relationship, and we could map them onto one another and do some sophisticated quantitative kinds of things with them. But when you're doing historical research and you're just picking up bits and bobs of information in snatches from here and there and everywhere, you can't do that. You don't have that systematic survey-like information on all of your cases, and so you have to work in a different way. I think I've probably only got about 2 minutes left, haven't I? So I was also going to say that similarly, although it's very difficult for me to look at processes of diffusion and social influence in these networks in any kind of quantitative way, there's lots of elements within the archive to suggest qualitatively that this was what was happening. Lots of evidence to talk about how the size of audiences increased and how you could see people drawing their friends in to these events. There's an interesting element, I think, of collective identity, which again you don't get from the network data, but you do get from the qualitative data, which was about having your hair cut short. It was for different reasons, different mechanisms. Everybody, having all been hippies in the mid-70s, were switching to punk, and the way in which they signalled that switch to punk was by getting their hair cut. In some cases it was coercive almost, so Mick Jones more or less had to be forced to get his hair cut. And other people, Captain Sensible down there at the bottom, realised that if you wanted to be part of the party, you had to have short hair. That was what was happening. It was a rite of passage, and he wanted to do it. But this is the kind of content of the ties. This is what was going on within the network. This is the sort of thing that adjacency matrices and quantitative methods don't allow me to get at, but which a more open-ended qualitative archival approach does allow me to get at. So a few closing thoughts there. I suppose the key one really is, and I'll finish on this, is that it's always the kind of mixed method debate in social network analysis has always puzzled me slightly, because I wonder really what there is to debate. Just in the sense that, well, yeah, you know, the world's multifaceted, it's got lots of different aspects, and no one method will get at any one of those, at all of those aspects, so we ought to just use different methods and we just combine them. And there is a part of me that kind of thinks, I still don't really see what the problem is. I don't see what the issue is. I mean, of course I recognise that professional interests become involved, and perhaps that's where the issue is, and that's where these struggles are. But it always kind of seems to me that you, if you had a plumber come to your house and the plumber said, I only use spanners. No, you know, I'm not going to use screwdrivers. I don't use hammers, and I certainly have nothing to do with saws. You would just get them out of the house as quickly as you possibly could. And yet somehow in the social sciences, the fact that somebody has one method and that's their identity and that's their kind of, you know, that is who they are and all that they'll do, does kind of pass as acceptable. And clearly that's a nonsense. And I guess events like this today show that you all think that that's a nonsense as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very stimulating talk, and I'm left with this abiding memory of Captain Sensible. I don't know how anybody else, probably we're showing our age here, but I remember, oh yeah, Captain Sensible on top of the pops with a parrot singing, talking, happy talk, but I won't sing it, so you're all right. Okay, so with that abiding metaphor of social scientists as plumbers who are using all the tools in their toolbox, I hope, can I just check, Eleanor, do we have another microphone for questions, or are we sharing the same microphone?
No, I think you're sharing.
Okay, we're sharing the microphone. We've got 10 minutes for questions. Unfortunately, I think we have to use the microphone, otherwise we are being filmed. I probably should have said that at the beginning, sorry. If anybody doesn't want to be filmed, then you know, the camera's over there. And just turn your back to it. So yeah, we'll need to hand the microphone around. So maybe what I'll do is take a cluster of questions, and then it's easier to share the microphone that way. So maybe if we could start off with 2 or 3 questions, or 1 or 2 questions. Okay, so we've got 1 there and 1 here. So if we pass the microphone around that way. Sorry. And if you could just introduce yourself as you start your question.
Hi, my name's Matthew Foster from the RSA. A question about bounding the research sites and why do you take London as a kind of definite unit? I mean, my musical history is not perfect, so I'm thinking of things that are happening in New York and how influential they may have been and how that comes into the analysis.
If you just hold fire, thank you.
Hello, Bruce Evans, Centre for Policy Modelling in Manchester. I got a lot of from your talk about how the social network analysis sort of informed and maybe directed your search for qualitative data. Is there any way in which the loop is completed in which your qualitative research might suggest another round or a different kind of network research, maybe finding the links in a different way or something like that?
Is there one other question, or else I'll give Nick a chance to respond?
Thanks. Right, okay, yeah. So, I mean, the bounding of the network is an interesting question. I mean, and it's and it's a difficult one, and it's easy to become very circular because one of the ways to have bounded the network would have been to sort of look at the network and kind of say where does it end or where does it appear to end. I mean, I think I bounded the network in this case by focusing upon UK sources and looking at, and I identified the actors in the network or the nodes in the network really by looking at who was mentioned in the secondary sources and who was mentioned in the archival sources. There is a story though about New York. I mean, I should have plugged the book, and there is a book on this later this year. And in that marvellous book, which I'd recommend to absolutely everybody, I do talk about New York, and it's interesting, and it actually works in terms of these network models as well, because early in Malcolm McLaren in the 1970s had become a huge fan of the New York Dolls, and the New York Dolls used to shop, or he was a clothing supplier for the New York Dolls in the mid-1970s, and in 1975 the New York Dolls were starting to get into difficulties. It looked as if they were as if they were going to fold, and so McLaren goes over to the States and steps in as a manager of the New York Dolls, which was the absolute kiss of death. I mean, the minute he got there, they more or less folded, and that was the end of it. But whilst he was there, he was taken along to CBGB, which was the big sort of club in New York where the Ramones were playing, Patti Smith was playing television, and those kind of proto-American punk bands were all playing. And McLaren was clearly hugely influenced by that because Richard Hell, the lead singer of Television, had the spiky hair, he had the ripped t-shirts, he had the safety pins, and there's a lot of controversy in punk history about whether that was just pinched directly from New York. But McLaren actually, they didn't have John Lydon as the singer of the Sex Pistols at this point in time, and he tried to recruit both Richard Hell to be the lead singer of the Sex Pistols and also David Johansen, maybe from the New York Dolls, one of the New York, Johnny Thunders maybe it was, he tried to recruit to be the lead singer of the Sex Pistols. So, I mean, in the book I do talk about this a bit, and I know you said you don't like bridging, but it's an absolute sort of wonderful bridging situation because you've got these events going off in New York, and the people in New York have really mostly got no idea of what's happening in London. And then you've got these happening in London, and the people in London aren't really very aware of what's going on in New York because it's so new. I think Patti Smith has released a record by this point, and Patti Smith Patti Smith was certainly popular, but she wasn't that obviously punky. And the Ramones, I mean, the Ramones were the big American influence, but the Ramones hadn't released any records at this point in time. So you've got these two geographically separated networks. Neither of them really know very much about one another, but you've got Malcolm McLaren in the middle. And Malcolm McLaren is a broker who is bringing ideas and trying to bring people from New York to London, and is certainly hugely inspired by it. So, so the boundary question is a problem, and I suppose you get around it by doing what I've just done, which is to try and tell a story that sort of vaguely justifies the way you've done it. But New York is part of it. And in terms of qualitative feeding back into quantitative, I mean, yes, that is happening constantly, really. That the quantitative material raises qualitative questions, and you go back to the archive and you look through the archive and you try to find qualitative answers to those questions. But on the other hand, the qualitative analysis is prompting quantitative type questions, and you're going back to the adjacency matrices and so on with a view to trying to find more. And I suppose there are probably two examples of that. One would be that within the qualitative data there were a lot of references to elitism and to different factions and groups. And so Captain Sensible, who we've already talked about, says, well, the punks were also snobby. You know, they never wanted to talk to me. They were all just in their own little group. And so I was able to go back to the network, and I was able to use various of the quantitative algorithms, the I-index, and other forms of homophily analysis, and look within the network to see where it was breaking down, where the factions were. And it was right. I mean, Captain Sensible was right. He did really form a bit of an isolated faction on the outside of the broader network. And I suppose the other example really would have been the way in which the project unfolded as I went from London to Manchester, and then from Manchester to Liverpool and Sheffield. I mean, when I was researching the London stuff, I came across these fantastic accounts of the Sex Pistols' first gig in Manchester. And in fact, there's been a book written about the Sex Pistols' first gig in Manchester, and it's called something like I Swear I Was There, and that's because everybody in Manchester claims that they were at the first Sex Pistols gig in Manchester, whereas the records suggest that perhaps about 30 people were actually there. And so that, in a sense, that kind of qualitative provocation led me to go back and think, right, okay, well, let's start to look at the Manchester network quantitatively and gather a new set of data and see how we go there. But certainly, I think it's a dialogue. I mean, in the stuff I did with Gemma, I think we actually explained that paper as a dialogue about the way in which quantitative analysis forced us to be qualitative, qualitative analysis forced us to be quantitative again, and so on. And the overall analysis took form within that dialogue.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nick. I think we need to move on to the next session, but there'll be time later on for more discussion and questions as well, so thank you very much.